The keycard felt impossibly light in my palm, a thin slice of plastic that weighed more than the whiskey I'd just finished. It sat there, cool against my skin, the edges sharp enough to cut through the haze of 2 a.m. Around me, the Obsidian Lounge was finally exhaling, the frantic energy of the night settling into a low, smoky hum. But my pulse was hammering a different rhythm. I held the access to a room that wasn't mine, slid across the mahogany by a woman who hadn't spoken a single direct sentence to me all night. I looked up. Behind the bar, she was watching. The Obsidian Lounge wasn't just a bar. It was a theater where the city's restless ambition came to rehearse. The lighting was low, amber, and deliberate, designed to make tired executives look mysterious and bad decisions look like destiny. I sat in the deep wingback chair in the far corner, the vantage point of the ghost. I wasn't part of the scene. I was a traveler passing through, invisible to the regulars who were too busy projecting their own importance to notice the woman nursing a single neat scotch for 3 hours. But I noticed them, and more importantly, I noticed her, Sylvie. She was the center of gravity in a room determined to spin out of control. While the floor staff navigated the tables with frantic smiles, Sylvie operated behind the bar with a terrifying, silent efficiency. She didn't rush. Rushing implies a lack of control. She moved with the focus of a master clockmaker dismantling a timepiece. Every movement had a purpose, every gesture a calculated result. I watched a man in a suit that cost more than my car lean over the bar, his tie loosened, his smile wet and hopeful. He was trying to buy her attention with a black card and a heavy tip. Sylvie didn't even blink. She took the order, her face a mask of polite, impenetrable professional distance. She was a wall of glass, transparent enough to be seen, but impossible to touch. She slid his drink across the coaster with a nod that was technically courteous, but emotionally vacant. He walked away thinking he'd made progress. I saw him for what he was. Just another transaction in a night full of them. The noise in the lounge was a physical weight. The clatter of ice, the roar of laughter that was too loud to be genuine, the thrum of bass from the hidden speakers. But behind the bar, there was a different soundtrack. It was the rhythm of Sylvie's work. The sharp crack of the shaker tin ceiling, the soft hiss of carbonation, the distinct heavy thud of a bottle returning to the rail. It was a language of friction and fluid dynamics, and she spoke it fluently. The air smelled of expensive gin, old leather, and the underlying metallic scent of adrenaline. It was the smell of people terrified of being alone. I breathed it in, feeling the separation between my stillness and their movement. I was safe here in the shadows, protected by my irrelevance. She wore the uniform, a crisp white shirt, black vest, sleeves rolled exactly to the elbow, like armor. It deflected the gaze of the room, turning her into a function rather than a person. Bartender. Service. But from my corner, I saw the tension in her jaw when the noise got too loud. I saw the way her fingers tapped a silent count against the copper bar top when a customer took too long to order. I saw the fatigue she hid behind the mascara and the stoicism. Most people looked at Sylvie and saw the drink they wanted. I looked at her and saw the architecture of her restraint. It was fascinating. It was magnetic. I found myself tracking the line of her throat as she swallowed water between orders, the way the muscles in her forearms flexed when she cracked a seal. The proximity of the bar to the tables created a false sense of intimacy for the patrons, but for me, the distance was the point. It allowed me to study the mechanics of her isolation. Then the crowd began to thin. The desperate energy faded into a dull, boozy weariness. The last call lights flickered, a subtle shift in the room's temperature. Sylvie began the closing ritual, wiping down the mahogany, polishing the taps. It was in this quiet, in the space between the chaos and the end, that I saw it, the crack in the armor. I had been cataloging the anomaly for 2 weeks. It always happened at 3:15 a.m., long after the last desperate patron had stumbled out into the city drizzle. The cleaning crew would be dragging mops across the tile in the foyer, but Sylvie would still be behind the bar, counting the till. That's when the performance dropped. She would stop, lean against the back counter, and make herself a drink. It wasn't the watered-down rail vodka the staff usually swilled. It was a ritual. She would take a heavy rocks glass, invert it over a piece of burning cedar, trapping the white smoke. Then she'd pour a double shot of the top shelf rye, the bottle kept on the high shelf that required a ladder for anyone else. 2 dashes of walnut bitters. No sugar, no garnish. She drank it standing up, staring at the empty room with a look of pure, unadulterated silence. It was the only time she looked like herself. Tonight, I didn't wait for the room to empty. The lull hit around 1:45 a.m., a sudden, strange vacuum in the noise where the bass dropped out and the laughter died down. It was my window. I stood up from the wingback chair. My legs felt stiff, the blood rushing back into them as I crossed the floor. The distance from the shadows to the bar was only 20 feet, but it felt like crossing a border. I was leaving the safety of the audience and stepping onto the stage. Sylvie was wiping down the copper rail, her head down, her focus absolute. She didn't look up as I approached. She assumed I was just another suit needing a refill, another problem to be managed with a nod and a pour. "I'd like to order off the menu," I said. My voice was steady, but I felt the vibration of it in my chest. She paused, the rag stilling in her hand. She didn't look up yet. "Kitchen's closed. We only have the late-night list." "I don't want food," I said. I placed my hands on the bar, leaning in just enough to breach the standard customer perimeter. "I want the rye. Top shelf, walnut bitters, smoked glass, no garnish." The silence that followed was heavy. It had texture. Sylvie slowly lifted her head. For the first time all night, maybe for the first time in 2 weeks, her eyes locked onto mine. There was no customer service glaze, no polite deference. Her gaze was sharp, dark, and completely unflinching. She looked at me with the calculation of a predator, assessing a sudden movement in the grass. "That's not a standard build," she said. Her voice was lower now, stripped of the professional lilt. It was husky, tired, and real. "I know," I replied. "It's the one you make for yourself when you think no one is watching." A muscle feathered in her jaw. She dropped the rag. It hit the counter with a wet slap. She didn't deny it. She didn't laugh it off or play coy. She just held my gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly, measuring me. The silence stretched, heavy with the sudden, terrifying intimacy of being known. "You're the scotch drinker," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Corner booth, 3 hours. You never look at your phone." "I prefer to watch the room," I said. "I like seeing how things work." "And what did you see?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the ambient jazz. "I saw precision," I answered honestly. "I saw someone who values the specific weight of things." She stared at me for a heartbeat longer, the tension coiling tight in the space between us. Then the corner of her mouth lifted. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement, a concession. She turned to the back bar. The preparation was different this time. It wasn't the efficient, robotic service she gave the crowd. It was slow, deliberate. She moved with a fluid grace, grabbing the cedar plank and the torch. The hiss of the flame was sharp. She trapped the smoke in the glass, and for a moment, the smell of burning wood and deep forests drowned out the scent of stale gin. She poured the rye, she dashed the bitters, she stirred it, the spoon moving against the glass with a soft, rhythmic clink that sounded like a secret code. She wasn't just making a drink, she was answering me. She was acknowledging that the wall of glass between us had just developed a hairline fracture. She set the glass down on a thick leather coaster. The smoke swirled inside, a trapped storm waiting to be released. She slid it across the mahogany toward me, her hand lingering on the base for a fraction of a second too long. The glass arrived with a cinematic stillness, the only stable object in a room that felt like it was spinning on a tilted axis. The smoke inside the tumbler was a living thing, curling in slow white ribbons against the crystal, obscuring the amber liquid beneath. I could feel the cold radiating from the glass before I even touched it, a sharp drop in temperature that cut through the humid warmth of the lounge. Sylvie didn't say a word. She didn't offer a cocktail napkin or a stirrer. She simply placed the drink on the leather coaster with a soft, decisive thud and withdrew her hand. The movement was final. It was a handover. I waited for the smoke to settle, the anticipation sitting heavy in my throat. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the condensation that was already beating on the surface. The glass was heavy, substantial. I lifted it, bringing the rim to my lips, inhaling the sharp, woodsy scent of burning cedar and rye. It smelled like a cabin in winter, like isolation and warmth. I took the first sip. It was perfect. Complex, spicy, with the bitter edge of the walnut cutting the sweetness. It tasted like something that shouldn't exist in a bar this loud. But as I lowered the glass, the sensory pleasure vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. Resting on the coaster, in the dry circle where the glass had been, was a rectangle of white plastic. It wasn't a receipt. It wasn't a business card. It was a standard issue hotel keycard, the magnetic strip facing up, a jagged black horizon line against the sterile white. My breath hitched. I set the glass down, missing the coaster by an inch, the sound of the crystal hitting the wood too loud in my own ears. I looked around instinctively, a reflex of guilt. Had anyone seen? The couple to my left was arguing in hushed, vicious whispers. The group of businessmen at the far end was roaring with laughter. No one was looking at the coaster. No one was looking at the transaction that had just dismantled the rules of the house. I stared at the card. It looked innocuous, a piece of disposable technology you lose in the bottom of a suitcase. But here, in the dim light of the Obsidian Lounge, it felt radioactive. This was a breach, a massive, reckless breach of protocol. Bartenders at high-end hotel lounges don't slide room keys to customers. It was a fireable offense, a crossing of the line so absolute that it made my hands shake. Sylvie was the picture of control, the architect of order. Yet she had just handed me a chaotic variable. I reached out and covered the card with my hand, sliding it off the bar and into my palm. It was warm from the ambient heat of the counter. I flipped it over. There, written in black permanent marker on the matte surface, were 3 digits. 412. The numbers were jagged, written in haste, the ink slightly smeared on the 2. Room 412. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The Obsidian Lounge was attached to the Meridian Hotel, a tower of glass and steel that rose 40 stories above us. She wasn't inviting me to her apartment across town. She was inviting me upstairs, right now. The immediacy of it was suffocating. It implied that she either lived in the hotel, unlikely, or she had booked a room specifically for this purpose, specifically for tonight. Specifically, perhaps, for me. I looked up, needing to find her, to verify that I hadn't hallucinated the entire exchange. Sylvie had moved to the far end of the bar. She was serving the loud group of businessmen, pouring shots of tequila with that same detached, surgical precision. One of the men said something, leaning in too close, invading her workspace. Sylvie didn't flinch. She smiled, a razor-thin, terrifyingly polite expression that didn't reach her eyes, and slid the shots across the bar. The contrast was dizzying. To them, she was the service staff, a beautiful object to be flirted with and tipped. To me, she was a conspirator. She was maintaining the integrity of the performance while the backstage pass burned a hole in my hand. As if she felt the weight of my gaze, she turned. She didn't look at the men. She didn't look at the register. She looked directly across the length of the bar, through the smoke and the noise, and locked eyes with me. It wasn't a seductive look. It wasn't a wink or a shy glance. It was a challenge. Her face was still, her expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But I saw the tension in her shoulders. I saw the way her hand rested flat on the bar top, grounding herself. Her eyes held mine, dark and unflinching, asking a silent question. Did you see? Do you understand? Are you brave enough? The space between us narrowed, vibrating with the static of unsaid things. The noise of the lounge faded into a dull roar, a distant ocean that couldn't touch us. It was just me, her, and the plastic key in my hand. I broke the gaze first. I couldn't handle the intensity of it. Not here. Not with the evidence pressing against my palm. I looked down at the drink. Her drink. The smoked rye. I picked it up. My hand was steady now, anchored by the decision I had already made without realizing it. I finished the drink in one long, steadying swallow. The burn was grounding. It was liquid courage, and I needed every drop. I didn't leave a tip on the bar. That would have felt transactional, cheap. I stood up, the leather of the stool creaking. I slid the keycard into the pocket of my coat, keeping my hand wrapped around it, ensuring it was real. I didn't look back at the bar. I didn't wave goodbye. I turned my back on the noise, on the smoke, on the safety of the observer's corner, and walked toward the exit. But I didn't head for the street doors. I turned left, toward the bank of elevators that led to the hotel lobby. The transition had begun. Leaving the Obsidian Lounge felt like stepping out of a pressurized cabin and into the vacuum of space. The heavy velvet curtains that separated the bar from the hotel lobby swallowed the bass of the jazz and the roar of the crowd, leaving me in a sudden, ringing silence that made my ears pop. The air here was different, cooler, thinner, smelling of polished marble and lilies rather than gin and smoke. I walked across the lobby, my boots clicking sharply on the stone floor. The sound was exposed, rhythmic, a metronome counting down the seconds to a decision I couldn't unmake. The concierge desk was empty, a stark island of granite under the dim, recessed lighting. I kept my head down, bearing my chin in my coat, avoiding eye contact with the night porter polishing the brass railing near the entrance. I felt like a smuggler, carrying contraband, the plastic rectangle in my pocket burning against my hip. I wasn't a guest here. I was an intruder, a variable that didn't fit the equation of the hotel's carefully curated ecosystem. I walked with a purpose I didn't feel, moving toward the elevator bank with the feigned confidence of someone who belonged. I pressed the button. The metal was cold against my fingertip. I stood there, watching the digital numbers above the brushed steel doors descend. 38, 25, 14. Each number was a floor, a layer of concrete and steel, separating me from the reality I had just left. When the doors slid open with a soft, polite chime, the car was empty. I stepped inside and the doors closed, sealing me in a box of mirrors and gold railing. I pressed 4. As the car began to rise, I caught my reflection in the polished brass of the control panel. I looked different here. The lighting in the elevator was unforgiving, stripping away the flattering amber glow of the bar. I looked pale, my eyes wide, a little frantic. I looked like someone who had just jumped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the water. My stomach dropped as the floor pushed up against the soles of my feet. It wasn't just the physics of the ascent. It was the gravity of the situation. I was going up to a room that wasn't mine, to wait for a woman I barely knew, based on a silent invitation slid across a bar top. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not to people who worked data entry and paid their taxes on time. The elevator slowed. The bell dinged, a singular, isolating note. The doors opened onto the 4th floor. The hallway stretched out before me, a long, endless tunnel of beige and cream, illuminated by sconces that cast scalloped shadows on the walls. The silence here was heavy, muffled by the thick, patterned carpet that seemed to absorb sound before it could even form. I stepped out, the elevator doors closing behind me with a finality that made my breath hitch. I was committed now. I walked down the corridor, counting the numbers. 402, 404, 406. The air smelled of industrial cleaning agents, a sharp lemon chemical scent, layered with the faint, ghostly perfume of 1,000 previous guests. It was a transient space, a place where people paused but never stayed. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a violent rhythm that felt too loud for this hushed environment. I kept waiting for someone to open a door and ask what I was doing, but the hall remained empty, a stillness that felt almost curated. I reached 412. It was at the end of the hall, a heavy wooden door identical to all the others, distinguished only by the brass plaque screwed into the wood. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the number. The doubt washed over me, cold and paralyzing. What if the key didn't work? What if this was a mistake, a cruel game? What if I opened the door and found a family of 4 sleeping, or worse, an empty room that remained empty all night? The fear of humiliation was almost stronger than the fear of danger. I pulled the keycard from my pocket. My hand was trembling slightly. I held it up to the black sensor box above the handle. Beep! A small green light flashed. The mechanism inside the lock clicked, a heavy, mechanical sound of a barrier dissolving. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It worked. The access was real. I pushed the handle down. The door swung open effortlessly, revealing a room swallowed in darkness. I stepped across the threshold. The room was cool, the air conditioning humming a low, white noise drone. I didn't turn on the lights. The illumination from the hallway spilled in behind me, cutting a rectangle of light across the carpet. I closed the door, plunging myself into the dark. But it wasn't empty. Not really. The air here didn't smell like the sterile hallway. It smelled like sandalwood and citrus, her scent. It was faint but unmistakable, clinging to the curtains, the pillows, the air itself. She had been here. She had claimed this temporary box of a room, marking it with the same invisible precision she used behind the bar. I walked further in, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the city, but a sliver of street lamp glow cut through the gap, illuminating the edge of a perfectly made bed. I stood in the center of the room, the silence ringing in my ears. I was standing in the center of her secret. And then I heard it, the faint chime of the elevator down the hall, the muffled rhythm of footsteps on the carpet, getting louder, getting closer. The pause outside the door. The lock clicked again. The door swung inward, slicing a wedge of harsh, artificial hallway light across the carpet. I didn't move. I stood in the darkness of the room, my breath caught in a chest that felt too small for my heart. For a second, she was just a silhouette framed in the brightness, a cutout of the bartender I had watched all night. Then she stepped inside. She didn't look at me immediately. She turned back to the door, her hand finding the deadbolt with practiced familiarity. She threw the lock. The heavy, metallic thud of the bolt sliding home was the loudest sound in the world. It was a punctuation mark, a definitive end to the public performance, and the beginning of something private. The hallway light was gone, leaving us in the blue-gray ambient glow of the city filtering through the curtains. Sylvie leaned her forehead against the wood of the door for a second, letting out a long, shuddering exhale. It was a sound of absolute release, the kind of noise you only make when you are certain no one is judging you. When she turned to face me, the change was visceral. The Sylvie from the bar, the woman of steel and glass, the architect of the room, was gone. In her place was a woman who had been standing for 10 hours, whose reserve had finally run dry. "You found it," she said. Her voice was rougher here, stripped of the polished cadence she used for customers. "The key worked," I replied, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet. She pushed off the door and walked past me, dropping a brown paper bag onto the small round table by the window. The smell of it hit me instantly. Hot chili oil, garlic, and steam. It was the smell of late-night survival, of street food bought from a cart at 3 a.m. because nothing else is open. It grounded the scene instantly. We weren't in a romance novel. We were two tired people in a hotel room with takeout. Then she began to dismantle the armor. I watched, mesmerized, as she unbuttoned the black vest. She shrugged it off, letting it fall onto the armchair with a heavy, careless slump. It was a shedding of weight, a physical rejection of the role she played downstairs. She loosened the tie, pulling the silk strip from around her neck and draping it over the lamp. She undid the top button of her crisp white shirt, exposing the hollow of her throat to the cool air of the room. But the most intimate moment wasn't the clothes. It was the hair. She reached up, her fingers finding the pins that held her severe, perfect chignon in place. She pulled them out, one by one, dropping them onto the glass tabletop with soft tinks. When the last one came free, she shook her head. Her hair tumbled down, a dark, heavy wave that softened the sharp angles of her face. She ran her hands through it, massaging her scalp, closing her eyes. It was a gesture of such raw, unguarded comfort that I felt like I should look away. But I couldn't. "I haven't eaten since 4, she murmured, gesturing to the bag. "I hope you like spicy." We sat on the floor by the window, the heavy curtains pulled back just enough to reveal the skyline. The city was a grid of amber and white below us, silent through the thick glass. She unpacked the containers, Szechuan noodles, red with oil, and dumplings that were still steaming. We ate in a companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the scrape of plastic forks and the hum of the city. "The drink," she said suddenly, not looking at me. She was staring out at the lights. How did you know? Nobody notices the drink. They notice the pour or the speed or the smile. They never notice the recipe. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, considering the answer. I didn't watch the bartender, I said softly. I watched the person waiting for the room to empty. You make that drink with a specific kind of reverence. You don't make it for the guests. You make it to survive the guests. Sylvie turned to me then. In the half-light, her eyes were huge, dark pools of exhaustion and curiosity. Precision, she repeated, echoing my words from the bar. Most people want to be seen, but they don't want to be read. It feels predatory. But when you ordered that, it felt like being understood. She leaned back against the wall, her legs stretched out on the carpet, her shoulder brushing against mine. The contact was electric, a sudden reminder of the proximity. The room, which had felt spacious when I entered, suddenly felt incredibly small. The air between us thickened, charged with the scent of chili oil and the sandalwood perfume that was now warming against her skin. It's too quiet in here, she whispered, the tension in the room spiking. And the walls are too close. She stood up, extending a hand down to me. Her fingers were rough, cool, and strong. Come on, I have keys to the roof. The service elevator took us to a level marked only by a blank steel button. Sylvie pressed it with a casual authority that made my stomach flip. When the doors slid open, the wind hit us first, a sharp, biting gust that smelled of ozone and wet concrete. We stepped out onto the roof, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind us, sealing out the sterile safety of the hotel below. It was a landscape of stark contrasts, suspended 40 stories above the grid. The pool was a long, narrow rectangle of illuminated turquoise, heating coils fighting a losing battle against the December chill. Steam rose from the surface in thick, lazy columns, twisting in the wind like spirits escaping. The city skyline was a jagged wall of amber and white light in the distance, close enough to see the pulse of the traffic, but too far to hear the noise. Up here, the roar of the streets was just a low-frequency hum, a vibration in the soles of our shoes, rather than a sound. Technically, the pool closes at 10, Sylvie said, her voice snatched away by the wind. She walked to the edge of the water, her boots silent on the damp tiles. But the night shift has its perks. Access is the only real currency that matters. She sat down on one of the teak lounge chairs, pulling her legs up, wrapping her arms around her knees against the cold. She still wore her work shirt, the white silk now rumpled, the top buttons undone. I sat on the chair next to her. The distance between us was maybe 6 inches of freezing air, but the heat radiating from her was palpable. It bridged the gap, a magnetic field that made the hair on my arms stand up. I looked at her profile against the glowing steam. Do you come up here often? Every night, she admitted, staring at the water. Down there, in the lounge. I'm public property. I'm a dispenser of alcohol and therapy. Everyone wants a piece. They want to tell me their secrets because they think I'm safe. They think I don't remember. She turned her head, resting her chin on her knee. But up here, there's no one to serve. Just the sky and the silence. And now me, I said quietly. And now you. She didn't look away. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face. You're different, though. You don't want to be part of the show. You sit in the back row, the observer. I like the view from the back row, I said. You see the things people try to hide, the hesitation before a lie, the way a hand shakes when it pays the bill. It feels safer to watch the machine than to be a cog in it. And what did you see in me? Her voice was barely a whisper, carried on the steam. I saw someone who was tired of being looked at but never seen, I answered. I saw the architecture of your defense mechanisms, the way you use silence as a weapon, the way you build that drink like you're casting a spell to keep the world away. Sylvie uncurled her legs and turned her body toward me. The movement was slow, deliberate. Being watched usually feels like being hunted, she said, her eyes searching my face in the blue light. In this job, eyes are hands. They grab, they take. But when I felt you watching me, it didn't feel like taking. It felt like calibration, like you were measuring the weight of the moment. She reached out, her hand hovering over the space between our chairs. She didn't touch me, not yet. She just let her fingers trace the cold air near my arm. I'm not used to being understood, It's terrifying. Terrifying is good, I murmured. Terrifying means it matters. The steam swirled around us, damp and warm, creating a cocoon that separated us from the rest of the roof. The contrast was dizzying, the biting cold of the wind against my back, the heat of the pool, the intensity of her gaze. I felt a sudden, fierce desire to close the distance, to bridge those 6 inches and find out if her skin was as warm as the air she displaced. "You have the key," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest. "You knew the drink. You followed the map. You're not just an observer anymore. You crossed the line." "You invited me across," I reminded her. "I did." A small, wry smile touched her lips. "I wanted to see if you were brave enough to leave the corner." The wind picked up, a sudden gust that cut through my coat. I shivered, an involuntary reaction that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sylvie saw it. She shifted, sliding closer to the edge of her chair, eliminating half the distance between us. "It's cold," she whispered. The statement was a fact, but it was also an invitation. The air was charged, thick with the potential energy of 2 bodies moving toward a collision. The steam from the pool was thinning, torn apart by the wind that whipped around the corners of the building. It was bitter cold, the kind of December bite that seeps through wool and settles in the marrow. But neither of us moved. The discomfort was a necessary anchor, a physical reminder that we were high above the world where consequences usually lived. I watched the way the amber light from the city reflected in Sylvie's eyes, turning them into dark, glittering mirrors. "Why the keycard?" I asked. The question had been burning in my throat since I lifted the glass. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a risk. If a manager had seen you slide a room key to a customer, you'd be fired before the shift ended. Why? Sylvie looked down at her hands, turning them over in the pale light. "You weren't a stranger," she said, her voice fighting the wind. "Strangers are the ones who ask for my number or try to touch my arm when I pour their wine. They see the vest, the lipstick, the service. You didn't see any of that." She looked up, her gaze locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "You saw the ritual. You ordered the drink I make when I need to remember who I am. That wasn't a pickup line." "Attraction is cheap," she continued, her voice low and rough. "I get hit on 20 times a night. It's noise. It's static. But attention, real, focused attention, that's rare. You watched me for 3 hours and you didn't try to own me. You just wanted to know the mechanism. That's why I gave you the key. I wanted to see if you were brave enough to see the rest of the machine." I looked at her hands resting on the cold teak of the lounge chair. They were fascinating. These were hands that spent 10 hours a night in ice and citrus. Hands that counted thousands of dollars in cash. Hands that managed the chaos of drunk men and demanding women. They were red from the cold now, the knuckles slightly rough, the nails short and practical. They were the hands of a worker, not a princess. "It's lonely," she admitted, following my gaze to her own fingers. "Being the center of the room. I talk to 300 people a night. I know their drink orders, their affairs, their business deals. I am the confessor. But nobody asks me a single question that matters. I'm surrounded by bodies, but I'm completely untouched." She shifted on the chair, the wood creaking softly. The movement brought her hand closer to mine. It wasn't a grab, it was a drift. Her fingers landed on the sleeve of my coat, near the wrist. She didn't grip it, she just traced the weave of the wool, a slow, hypnotic movement that sent a shockwave straight up my arm. "I wanted to be touched by someone who knew what they were holding," she whispered. The atmosphere shifted, becoming visceral. The wind was howling, the city was screaming below us, but the only thing that existed was the pressure of her index finger on my forearm. It was a near touch, a promise of contact that was infinitely more erotic than a grasp. I could feel the heat of her skin through the layers of my clothing. "I'm here," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm holding it." She looked at me, her defenses completely dismantled. The Sylvie of the Obsidian Lounge was gone. This was just a woman, on a roof, cold and terrifyingly open. The tension was a wire pulled so tight it hummed, vibrating with the potential energy of everything we hadn't done yet. "It's freezing," she said, her voice trembling, though I knew it wasn't just from the temperature. She pulled her hand back, breaking the circuit, but the charge remained. "We should go in," I replied. The cold was no longer bearable. The need for proximity was overriding the need for air. "Yeah," she breathed, standing up. "Room 412 is warmer." The door to room 412 clicked shut behind us, and the sound was different this time. Before, it had been the sound of entering a temporary space, a pause in the action. Now, it was the sound of the rest of the world being severed. Sylvie didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. The ambient glow of the city grid outside filtered through the sheer curtains, painting the room in shades of charcoal and electric blue. She moved to the center of the room and stopped. The cold from the roof still clung to the wool of her coat, a phantom layer of frost. But beneath it, the heat was rising, radiating outward in waves. I stood by the door, watching her. The distance between us was only a few feet, but the tension made it feel like a canyon we were both afraid to bridge, yet desperate to cross. "The cold," she whispered, her back to me. She was shivering, a subtle tremor that ran through her shoulders. I stepped forward. I reached out and took the lapels of her coat. My hands were shaking, not from the temperature, but from the sheer gravity of the moment. I slid the heavy wool from her shoulders. It fell to the floor with a soft thud, a discarded shell. She turned to face me. Without the coat, she was just in the white silk shirt, the fabric thin and translucent in the dim light. She looked at me, and the bartender was gone. The woman who managed the room with surgical precision had vanished. In her place was someone raw, open, and terrifyingly present. Her eyes searched mine, not scanning for a drink order or a threat, but looking for a place to land. "You're still watching," she murmured. "I never stopped," I replied. She took a step closer. The distance was negligible, yet heavy with everything we hadn't said for 3 hours. I could hear the sound of her breathing, shallow, slightly ragged. It was the only sound in the universe. She reached out, her hand finding the curve of my waist. The contact was electric. It wasn't a grab. It was an anchor. Her fingers pressed into the fabric of my shirt, pulling me in, not with force, but with a magnetic, undeniable gravity. I looked at her mouth. I looked at the pulse beating frantically in the hollow of her throat. The almost was a physical pain, a tightening in the chest that demanded release. "Do it," she breathed. I closed the distance. The first kiss wasn't a collision. It was a calibration. It was slow, deliberate, a reading of intentions written in the language of touch. Her lips were cool from the wind, tasting faintly of the rye and the cedar smoke, but her mouth was warm, yielding and demanding all at once. It wasn't the frantic, messy fumbling of a drunken hookup. It was precise. It had texture. I felt the weight of her exhaustion, the weight of her secrets, the weight of the mask she had carried all night. All of it pouring into the connection. I brought my hands up to cup her face. Her skin was soft, burning hot beneath my cool fingertips. Her hands, those hands that I had watched crack ice and count money, hands that were rough with work and competence, moved up my back, tangling in my hair, pulling me closer until there was no space left for the air to circulate. The roughness of her palms against my neck was a grounding reality. It was the texture of truth. We didn't stumble to the bed. We stood there, in the center of the room, anchored to each other, swaying slightly, like trees in a storm. The intimacy wasn't about the mechanics of sex. It was about the relief of contact. It was the feeling of finally setting down a heavy load you didn't realize you were carrying. For hours, I had been the observer, and she had been the performance. Now, the roles were dissolved. There was no audience. There was only the heat, the scent of rain, and the desperate, crushing need to be held. She pulled back just an inch, her forehead resting against mine. Her eyes were closed, her lashes dark against her cheekbones. "I feel," she started, her voice erect whisper. "I know," I said. "Me too." The unflinching gaze she used to deflect the world had softened into something fluid and vulnerable. We moved to the bed, not with urgency, but with the heavy, inevitable pull of exhaustion. Lying down felt like surrender. We didn't undress further. We just lay there, fully clothed, tangled together on top of the duvet. I wrapped my arms around her, burying my face in the curve of her neck, inhaling the complex human scent of her. She curled into me, her hand resting flat over my heart, feeling the rhythm of it slow down, matching hers. The physical tension that had been a wire pulled tight all night finally snapped. But it didn't break us. It released us. The adrenaline crashed, leaving behind a heavy, narcotic calm. The room was silent, save for the hum of the city and the sound of our synchronized breathing. I held her, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of her body against mine. It was the most honest thing I had ever felt. The darkness of the room wrapped around us, a protective blanket, as the night faded into the heavy, dreamless sleep of absolute relief. Daylight hit the room like an interrogation lamp. It filtered through the gap in the heavy blackout curtains, a sharp, uncompromising beam of white that sliced across the carpet, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. I blinked, the heavy, narcotic sleep of the night before evaporating into the harsh reality of 8 a.m. The magic of the Obsidian Lounge, the wind on the roof, the shadowed intimacy of the dark, it all felt distant now, bleached out by the sun. The room wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a transient space again, scattered with the debris of two people who had crashed hard. I sat up, the sheets pooling around my waist. The space felt transient again. The illusion of permanence we had built in the dark had dissolved. But then I smelled it. Coffee. Not the burnt, acidic sludge usually brewed in hotel rooms, but something rich and deep. Sylvie was standing by the desk. She had pulled her white shirt back on, though it was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up. She was messing with the small plastic pod machine, but she treated it with the same focused gravity she applied to the espresso rig downstairs. She watched the dark liquid drip into the paper cup, her profile softened by the morning light. She looked younger without the bar's armor, less like a deity of the night, and more like a woman who needed caffeine to function. She turned, sensing I was awake. There was no makeup, no performance, just her. She walked over and handed me the cup. "It's terrible coffee," she said, her voice raspy with sleep. I did what I could with the grind. I took the cup, our fingers brushing. A warm, familiar friction now, devoid of the electric shock of the night, replaced by a soft domestic hum. I took a sip. It was weak, but hot. "I'm sure it's perfect," I murmured. We drank in silence, sitting on the edge of the bed. The conversation wasn't heavy or laden with what are we questions. The night had been its own answer. We both knew the geometry of this encounter. She had a shift at 4 p.m. to prepare for the Friday rush. I had a train to catch, a job to return to, a life that existed outside the radius of the Meridian Hotel. "The sun ruins it a little, doesn't it?" she asked, looking at the slice of light on the floor. "It exposes the cracks." "It makes it real," I countered. "The night is for secrets. The morning is for evidence." She smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes. She stood up and walked to the small table where the coaster still sat, the one with 412 written on it. She picked up a pen from the hotel stationery pad. She wrote something on the back, her hand moving with that signature precision, then tossed it onto the duvet next to me. "I have to go," she said simply. No drawn-out goodbyes, no false promises of "I'll call you" or requests for my number. It was clean. It was honest. It was precise. "I know," I said. She pulled her coat on, the heavy wool hiding the silk shirt, the armor going back into place, piece by piece. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She looked back at me one last time, the morning light catching the dark wave of her hair. "Thank you," she said, "for watching." Then the door clicked shut, and the room was just a room again. I looked down at the coaster. Beneath the room number, she had written a single line in her sharp, angular script. "The back row has the best view." Stepping out of the hotel was a physical shock. The street noise hit me, a wall of traffic, sirens, and the aggressive rhythm of the city waking up. I merged into the flow of pedestrians, invisible once more, just another coat in the crowd. But I felt different. I felt rewired by the connection. I touched the coaster in my pocket, feeling the indented ink against my thumb. Most people walk past the closed doors, assuming they're locked. But I knew the truth now. Some doors open, but only if you know exactly where to look for the handle. If you've ever found a connection in the silence, subscribe for more stories like this.